then I'll share the screen. All right, hopefully you guys are aware that you are now currently being recorded. Okay, you should now be able to hopefully see the screen, the slide presentation. I'm going to open up the chat so that I can see it as we're going along. Okay, we're good. And see a little thumbs up. You can see the slideshow. You can hear me. We're good to go. Okay, super. Welcome to this retreat about effective online writing and discussion strategies. Just a quick sort of disclaimer. I could talk about online writing for a whole week, well, writing in general for a whole week, or discussions as sort of a kind of writing and a kind of an active learning for also a week. I tried to put all of that into a not too burdensome workshop for today in 6 short hours with some time in the middle for you guys to eat and breathe and hopefully apply some of what you're learning, or at least think about how it might apply in your classes. So there's more, much more, but I'm going to get you sort of start. My approach to this was sort of to think about really what's the research currently saying, what are the best practices being put forward for writing in general, and then how does that look online, and to try to really sort of give you some super summaries of some of that research, and then talk about some of those strategies might look like in practice. So hopefully that's going to get you what you need. If not, we will have the hour at the end to debrief. We can look more closely at something, and I'm always very happy to consult with you one-on-one to really start to think about how you might deploy some of these writing strategies in your actual classes. So let me make sure that I activated the right screen. So here we are, slide number 1. Here are some of the topics that I am going to talk through today. We'll start just by thinking about ways of thinking about writing. I think that some of those framing thoughts will be really helpful to sort of contextualize some of the research that I'm going to talk about a little bit and some of the strategies that I'll be exploring. Then we'll talk specifically about online writing, which, spoiler alert, is not all that different from regular writing. It's just happens digitally for the most part. We'll talk specifically and in sort of an isolated way. Not isolated isn't the right word, but in sort of an individual pausing place to talk about grading, scoring, and feedback as its own topic. Then we'll talk about online discussion forums. There'll be a bio break probably between part 2 and part 3, just so you know. It's good to know when that's coming. If you need to step out before, then by all means, go ahead. And then you'll have the independent application activity. Here's the tentative schedule. We'll see how long the presentation part goes. There will be a break in the middle at least, and I'll be asking you guys to sort of interact during that time. I'm going to push us till 1 if we can get there, because then we've sort of covered all the theory and the literature, and then have a bigger time to go ahead and apply, try to think of all of it together during your independent application time. And then we'll come back at the end for just an hour to sort of ask questions and debrief and talk about what's next, if you guys want some help thinking about how to go forward with it after that. As I said, there's a companion site. You should all be registered or added as teachers in that site, so that if you wanted to play, or you can have access to duplicating any materials that we build or that I later put in. If you for some reason don't have access to that, let me know, and during the independent application time I can add you. So that should work well. I think that that's everything for the agenda time, and we might finish earlier with the interactive presentation, in which case we'll just break earlier. Okay, so let's just start with some framing thoughts about writing in general. I think it's really important to remember, and you'll see this written lots of places. I tried to find who actually said this first, and there's nobody I could find who said this first. But that writing is a kind of thinking. Writing is thinking that's made visible. And if we approach designing writing activities and projects for our students from this place of thinking about what kind of thinking do I want them to do? How can they show that to me in writing? or how can they use writing to think, that really sort of shifts a little bit what we end up designing, I think, in positive ways. Writing, this seems obvious, but it's good to point it out and put it at the front. Writing should be meaningful. It should be iterative. They need multiple goes at the thing. And it should be interactive. Now, this is some of what comes out of the research. It's really helpful to remember that writing is, in fact, a process and not just a product. And so we have to teach the process and not the product. It's also a powerful tool for learning, not just a demonstration of learning. Some of that is really fleshed out more thoroughly in writing across the curriculum models and writing in the discipline models. You all will have access to this slideshow, so take notes as it helps you, but don't worry that you're not going to get this content. Writing best practice applies to online, traditional writing contexts, hybrid situations. The best practice for good writing pedagogy transcends modalities pretty much. I think it's really important to remember that participating in an online forum is a writing experience, unless they're recording video only. And in that case, it's still a composition experience. You have to compose what you're going to say, usually. As evidenced by anytime you ever try to do that, you end up deleting the video and trying again. Oh, wait, that's not what I meant to say. Delete and try again. That's composition with revision. And that really is, at the very least, it overlays writing skill and writing process. And an online forum is a tool that contains, organizes, and collects and shares thinking in a dialogic format. It is not in itself a learning experience. We will tell the students, oh, you have to do an online forum, do the forum, but really they're actually doing some sort of writing, thinking, interacting in a container. In the same way that a Word doc is not an essay, it's the tool that holds the essay. An online forum is a tool that contains a specific kind of thinking and interaction, a specific kind of dialogue. I think that separation is a helpful framing thought. So good news is that the writing pedagogy best practice, most of those best practice strategies overlap very well with online learning best practice and best practices for inclusive teaching, universal design for learning. My Venn diagram is, suggestive only. Really, there's probably a much larger overlap between what those best practices recommend. The good news is that if you do one, you're probably going to be activating multiple frameworks of best practice. So that's good news. Here are some, it's going to be a long list, so get comfortable. Some of the best practices for writing pedagogy that overlap with many other best practice frameworks. Chunking and scaffolding projects or larger artifacts or performances. For example, a big research paper, to chunk and teach separate parts and to distribute that over the semester is a best practice for writing. Same best practice for lots of other, a skill or a product that would actually have multiple skills and kind of component parts, but to break that up and display that, to deploy that over time is a best practice. Scaffolding, which is giving students different kinds of support and modeling as they become more independent learners through that process. Transparent teaching, you all know I love this. I really do. It's a writing best practice also. Giving them frequent opportunities at low stakes or no stakes practice. Usually you have to have some stake or they won't do it, sadly. This is really writing to learn. And I'm going to talk about the Bean book, which is actually called Engaging Ideas, but I just call it the Bean book because it's sort of a Bible for using writing to get at critical thinking. Looking at you, Carrie. Another best practice is continuous engagement with peers and the teacher. This is really important in online learning. In the student engagement retreat that we did, we talked a lot about getting students engaging with each other and how often they have engagement with a teacher. with writing pedagogy, talking with peers and the teacher frequently about writing is a best practice. Having peer learning opportunities. Can you learn from and with your peers about the content and about skills? That's really important. Prompt and timely feedback. This is a bear that a lot of us have to try to grapple with. I have some good ideas for this and a book that has many, many more, much better ideas about managing feedback on writing. So they need to get it soon after they do the performance, otherwise they can't really apply it, doesn't help them. They also need opportunities to revise based on that feedback. Another best practice is to try as much as possible to give students choice, agency, and autonomy in their writing, and also in all their learning. All of this probably seems familiar to those of you who have been participating in the workshops thus far. Another really important theme that was recurrent in the research about best practice for writing pedagogy and online discussion forums was that students need to be making connections between the coursework that they're doing and themselves, their present, their future, their past maybe, with any future tasks that they're going to need to do, and with the larger world. It's that connective piece that really makes a big difference for how effective writing experience and how meaningful it is to them. So all of these are really important best practices for writing. They overlap with a lot of other good things. So try to do as much of this as you can. So at this point, I'm just going to do some super summaries of some of what I've been reading right now about writing. Fair warning, I've been reading about writing and writing pedagogy for a really long time. So some of that will leak in, but some of the stuff I've been reading most recently is what I was going to try to share with you today. And then after we get sort of through some of this part, we'll have a little pause for questions. Okay. Phil says, Aristotle, see, it went way back. I didn't go far enough back. Aristotle says speech is a representation of the mind and writing is the representation of speech. So thinking, right? Making thinking visible, or at least hearable. That's probably not the word, but that's okay. Super summaries. Here is a really exciting article that I came across. It's exciting partly because it's really large scale and covers multiple institutions. So it was a big, giant study. And so they had lots of interesting things that they found in this study and reported out. So Anderson et al., 2015, not super recent, but in terms of writing pedagogy, it's not too bad. Here is just the part that I pulled out for us to talk about today, but there's more. And this is linked in the Moodle course. In order to even start to process all the data that they had from this study, they had to come up with 3 constructs of effective writing. And I think this is what's most immediately useful to us today. That one construct is that the writing processes should be interactive. The student isn't expected to just know how to do this process and to work through it alone. They need to be communicating orally or in writing, so discussion forum, asynchronous forum could work for that, with one or more people at some point between when they get that assignment and when they submit the final draft. And so this might mean for feedback with the professor, feedback with other students, peer review, all kinds of things like that. So getting them to interact through the process is really important. The second construct was that the writing tasks should be meaning making. What does meaning making mean? It means that they're integrating, or they're thinking critically, or they're creating original thinking, trying to apply the concepts that they're learning in their coursework to their own past experiences. So reflection, you're going to hear people talk about reflection all over the literature for all best practices and all kinds of things. And that actually is a meaning-making writing task according to these researchers. Supporting claims, we've been doing that forever, since Aristotle, probably, right, Phil? And or evaluating a policy, practice, or position. Any of you who were present for Don's little presentation on Tuesday, he actually has them doing some of this evaluative work in his discussion forums. Well, maybe not in the discussion forum, but in the class, they do an op-ed, which is really pinging very directly against this idea. And so that's a meaning-making task. And the last one that's a construct for effective writing is that the expectations need to be really, really clear. Even more clear than we think we have made them. And that's, of course, overlaps directly really with transparent teaching. So if you know transparent teaching, you're more than half the way there. So I'm going to talk about 3 studies. I think I have 3 of them in here. 3 different resources, I would say. This is another really exciting research project. I'm super excited about this one, called the Meaningful Writing Project. And these researchers asked seniors, so they're undergraduates, so sorry for those of you with graduate or professional people, but I still think the research is sound and applicable across the board. They asked seniors to self-report meaningful writing experiences they had had in college. And this was really exciting. They came up with lots of stuff, so I would really encourage going to their website. They have a whole book about it. But what they came to was that meaningful writing happens when students tap into the power of personal connection. See, we keep saying this connection again. What does this matter to me as a person? And that's a tricky thing that we have to bridge. In fact, I was just talking with Jenna Thompson, who's on here somewhere, about this idea of eventually our job to make scholars out of our students is to get them to where they can speak about these subjects in the absence of the self eventually. But that in order to have that experience be meaningful, they still have to feel some personal connection to it. And that some of the work we do in those really early writing classes is bridging that gap between you as the self experiencing college and experiencing these concepts to a larger way to think more objectively and write objectively about them. Meaningful writing happens when they're immersed in the thinking about it. Not just this writing matters to me because it's about a subject I care about, but they're deeply immersed in thinking and researching, which is maybe something that we don't always plan intentionally for. It occurs when they're writing, when what they write is relevant to the real world. So this is authentic, like authentic writing, authentic pedagogy that pings across this too. And if they can imagine their future selves. So this one I don't completely have, it was a little fuzzy for me even when I read the research, but I think some of this is about how does what I'm writing right now help me to think forward? And that, of course, if what I'm writing now matters to the future me, and people will sometimes say, well, that's a problem for future me. Hopefully when they're writing this, they're thinking this is a good thing for future me, or this is important for future me. That's where I come to. You guys might have sort of a different one. Oh yeah, so Carrie has the comment that this last point could be relevant if they're thinking about their future profession. Right, you're going to need this because you're going to need to know how to do this because if you have them actually writing or even curating research as sort of an apprentice in the discipline, then they feel like what they're doing, is the kind of thing they would do in that field. So they're acting as, professionals in an authentic way, which could be really powerful for students. So Meaningful Writing Project, that's linked in the Moodle course. I think it's an exciting thing. I'm really looking forward to digging into that a bit more, but these seem important for us today. The last thing I'm going to talk about is just general writing research is, of course, the Bean book, Engaging Ideas. In the very beginning, he opens with good writing assignments. And so what is that? What is a good writing assignment? It's meaningful, it's meaning making, it's interactive, it's clear, all those things we've seen up to this point. That if you got a good one, a good writing assignment, it will evoke critical thinking. It will help students wrestle productively. This is a tricky thing, right? We want them to wrestle, but not to the point that they're losing energy or it's not productive anymore. And that's a tricky thing to know. It really depends on your subject and your students. But that some struggle is really beneficial. That's a hard thing for students to learn, I think. They're not just struggling with, I don't understand your instructions. That's the wrong thing to be struggling with. They're struggling with the questions of the course. And I think that that's really something where we can work to make sure that they are on task, or they're keyed into what we want them to be struggling with. That we're not just letting them struggle because our instructions are unclear, or they don't know why they got the grade they got. That's the wrong place to be expending their energy. Teaching disciplinary ways of seeing, knowing, and doing in good writing assignments. So this is writing in the disciplines or writing across the curriculum. Those of you who have done some of that sort of training will recognize that concept. But a good writing assignment is helping them to know more about their discipline, helping them learn how to think in that discipline. And I think that's really, students report that that's very meaningful to them. So that's writing in general, some best practice of writing. So what about online? Okay, what does it look like when you move writing online, or when all of your writing is happening online? Really, it doesn't look significantly different when you're writing online as the way you have them do writing in your class, except that it's all digital. Online modalities don't really present, at least in my experience, the same difficulties as the online constraints do for other things like, I don't know, dissection in a lab, or compounding, drugs in the pharmacy, right? Some of those things it's much harder to do virtually. Online writing is actually becoming increasingly digital anyway. All writing is becoming increasingly digital. Any of you who have submitted articles for peer review, or, it's all done digitally. So I think that that's not such a big shift. To think about, though, thinking about moving the writing in your course online, really, I think what you mostly need to do is imagine a digital tool to replace whatever happens in paper in your regular process. Some of you don't have any paper in your regular process, so this is like a slide you can sleep through right now. But some of you do, and the place that many of us have paper is in our feedback to students. That was me at the very least, and I hear this from a lot of people. Where a lot of us have learned to read critically and offer feedback with a pen in your hand in the margins. So how do we do that when everything is online? And I'm going to speak more specifically to lots of ways to do that, or some ways to do that coming up. So that's a little preview. We'll talk about that soon. I noticed that Al linked the Bean book in the chat. It's also linked in the Moodle course, just so you guys know. And the last point to remember when you're thinking about, well, taking my writing online, if there is something that you feel like is just tremendously valuable for students to do on paper with a pen or a pencil, you can have them take a photo and send that photo to you. Put it in Moodle. Don't have them email it to you. Have them upload a photo to Moodle. Now, scanning through lots of comments on photos, or looking at student work that's come in as a photo, if they're very many pages, is pretty laborious. And I would definitely recommend trying to use a digital tool instead. But it's good to know, like, students all have a device. Even a flip phone can take a picture. They can get you a photo of something that they've handwritten. So Phil says that the challenge for him is to move from a dynamic conversation in class to interactive writing, not a challenge of moving face-to-face class to an online class. Can you pop in really quick, Phil, and just clarify that a little bit before we go on?
I see I dropped a word there. No, as I get that teaching writing either in a face-to-face environment or online is pretty similar. And this is something just to address later. But the challenge for me is, face-to-face class, you have this dynamic conversation within teams, across teams, and turning that into writing via forums, etc. That's really hard.
Yeah. Well, I think that the key thing you said
or at
there,
least I think it's really hard. Sorry.
The key thing you said is that it has to be turned into writing. If it's going to happen asynchronously, it does have to be turned into writing, or it has to be video audio recordings. So let's talk about that when we talk about discussion forums later.
Yeah.
But let's start thinking about that now, because what might happen is you might be able to design a writing assignment or writing activity, a writing experience is the better word, that can get at the same learning or the same goals. It won't look exactly the same, but it might get at the same goals. So that's a really, I think, an important thing to think about when we're trying to imagine a fully online deployment of what we've always done, at least partially face-to-face. Okay, so with your patience, I would like to sort of walk through some of these strategies in action in a writing class. So there were lots of them, right? The list had like 6 or 8 like best practice strategies you can do. And so you could do one-offs, of course, of these different strategies, but what tends to work better and feel more cohesive and natural for students is if you can come up with a sort of a process that integrates or stitches through as many of these strategies as possible. So in my English 180 course I taught a couple springs ago, I use a workshop model. I always use a workshop model, or I have for many years, to teach writing, and I'm teaching basically academic writing. So I understand this might be different from some of your disciplines, but it's a way to show how like one sort of sequence of assignments and interactions and activities can incorporate many different strategies. So I'm just going to walk you kind of through this with the caveat of it didn't always work. I didn't always apply it perfectly, but this was the model and I applied it pretty well, and most of the time it worked pretty well. I think that the strategies I used were very helpful. I didn't always execute it perfectly, but that's okay. So here are some of the strategies that I put together in this process. They actually just happened very naturally in the process. Chunking, so chunking the giant paper, research paper, into bits was one of the first things. A ton of scaffolding and modeling of that whole, all of the components and the processes. I did a thing that for lack of a better word, I call norming. I don't call it this with students because I don't know what I'm talking about, but you guys probably do, where we work with a model and or mentor text and then practice applying the rubric or the criteria to these mentor texts and deciding which ones are good or bad and why, based on what we understand about the criteria. A very valuable exercise that I highly recommend. I brought in peer learning through the peer review workshop. Peer review actually in writing workshop models is a little bit different than peer review like we do as professionals when we have someone sort of blind review our work and something like that. This is really more like a workshop where we're like, here's my draft. Help me think about what's good, what's not so good. Let's work together and have a shared investment in each other's success. I really tried to use frequent and targeted feedback with multiple opportunities for revision. That definitely was a part of it. And I kept the feedback separate from the score with regard to this final essay. So they did get points for doing the parts, but I wasn't scoring it against criteria. And I also, because this was a model class I was trying to build to try to just put everything in there, like all best practices I could, I also used a lot of choice. I incorporated authentic writing tasks because they were actually doing field-based inquiry into what's a problem in the field you eventually want to go into. Use transparent assignment design, and we used rubrics for most of that stuff, especially the final draft, of course, which they actually helped me co-create, which is a little scary, but it was great. You guys have heard me talk about that before. So all of those things, I try to bring all those strategies together, but I put them as a part of a process so that it didn't feel overwhelming and it didn't also feel disjointed to me to try to deploy all of these different things. So it was basically a 3-step process for each component of the larger paper. So we would model and scaffold. I would model and scaffold, and they would norm some things against the rubric. Then they would try to make the thing that they had just normed on their own, make their own version, and then that would get workshopped as a peer review, their first draft. And then they would give me a revised draft that I would then give feedback to. So that was the basic process. So just break each of those steps up a little bit to give you a little bit more detail. The first part, modeling, scaffolding, and norming. So I would introduce and they would encounter, because we were both doing something during that step. I introduced it, they encountered whatever the component was. Maybe it was an inquiry question or a thesis statement. Here's what the thing is. Here's your assignment you're going to end up doing. Here's the thing. Here's the component. And then I would also introduce the criteria, usually with the rubric. And then I would do a teacher think aloud where I analyzed a model of this component against the rubric or against the rubric or the criteria. Sometimes it was just a list of this makes a good inquiry question. And then I would talk about how an example, what was or wasn't meeting that criteria. And then in groups, they would analyze a couple of more models of that. And they would try to either score them on the rubric, or sometimes I would just give them multiple and I would say, okay, put them in order of most effective to least effective based on what you understand about the criteria for this component. And then they would have to talk about it and negotiate understanding and negotiate meaning. That's like gold, liquid gold right there. They have to negotiate. Well, no, I think this one should be the best because it does this, this, and this, see, on the list. And that's like worth $1 million, right? They're at least looking at the rubric and coming to understand what makes a good execution of this specific skill or product well before they even try to build one on their own. start to internalize those ideas. Really helpful. This third step works really well, either live synchronous or just a face-to-face class. So if you're going to use a live class for something, I think this is really, really valuable to do when they're all together live somehow. So that was step one. They did all that work. That was usually in a class period. And then, yes.
Before you go on, did you see Jeff's question to you in the chat?
Yes. So, oh yes, an example of scaffolding. So part of the scaffolding in multiple ways. If you look at it like in Universal Design for Learning and some of the other literature, what that would look like is, say, maybe I would give them a study guide, or I would better than that, like a notes for the chapter, and I would actually take those notes and give them the full notes the first chapter. The second time I would give them half those notes redacted, so they would have to fill in the blanks. And then the next time I would redact almost all the notes, and then they would have to do them independently. In terms of writing, the way I'm scaffolding it is that I'm sort of showing them a model text, and I'm breaking down what the moving parts are. And I'm also modeling how to read it, how to go through comparing something to the rubric, so that when they create it, they're ready. Does that make sense? Jennifer would like me to go back to the previous slide. Yes. So
thanks. Yeah, thank you.
I'm plugging scaffolding in with modeling, because the larger idea of breaking this up and showing parts and helping students work through it is often referred to as scaffolding. It's a little tricky because both of those words are used to mean slightly different things in different overlapping best practices literature. So I hope, Jeff, does that clear up your question? I'm seeing a nod. Excellent. Great. Jennifer, are we ready to go on?
Yep, thank you.
Cool. Okay, so then the students go off and they try to make the thing. Say it's a thesis statement. We talked a lot about thesis statements, good ones, bad ones, what makes a good one or a bad one. Now go make one. Okay, so they make a draft, which is, I always call their first best try. This is not a rough draft. That is rude to the people who are reading your first best try. You need to do your best you can do by yourself. And so then they post the first best try to a Moodle forum. I realized I linked this in the slides, but unless you're in that course, you're not going to be able to see the action. But I'm going to show you the instructions in a second. So sorry if that link leads you astray. At any rate, they post the draft, the first best try, to a forum, a discussion forum in Moodle. And then their partners, they're already in teams, or they're either in a partner or a team of 3. They read each other's drafts and make some comments. And then the writer looks at those comments, and or if we have a chance, they also talk about it face-to-face in class. Then the writer has to go back and say, based on this feedback I got on my first best try, here's what I need to do to make this draft better, to move it forward. And that's a really critical step that sometimes students missed. And I don't have like numerical data to support this, but I can tell you that the students who forgot to do the revision plan always scored lower on the final exam or the final paper than the students who consistently went back in and said, okay, here's what I need to do next. It also means when they go back to revise after they've done their OChem homework and their econ homework, they're like, I don't even remember what I was thinking about this draft. Instead of starting over with that paralyzing nothing, they can go back to that revision plan and say, oh yeah, here's my to-do list. Change this, work on this, work on this. It was really, really helpful to keep that momentum going forward. It was a really good, like a save point in a game. It was really, really helpful. So first best try, and then based on what you get for feedback for this one, make a plan. And then the thing that they do after that, oh, hold on, I'll come back to that. So here's what the instructions are in this is like a screenshot from my discussion forum. So the writer has 2 jobs in this forum, and the team member has a different job. So every student is both writer and team member, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And notice that there are different deadlines for the different activities. This is actually best practice for discussion forums. We're going to talk about this again later. So there are instructions. I've hyperlinked to resources in the Moodle course for the students. If they forget, how do I give feedback? Well, I teach them how to do good feedback, but they can also click on the writer's workshop resource and see some tips for things you can say in a response to your student or to your peers. And then there are revision plan guidelines. I can post those, Zara, in the Moodle course during the downtime, the guidelines, both of those for giving good feedback to your peers and also your revision plan guidelines. I'm happy to post that. Really, it's just 100 words where they just sort of say, hey, who gave you good advice? What did you learn about your draft? What's your plan going forward? I try to keep that really simple so that they just can go back and tie up that cognitive loop and then move on. It is important that their revision plan is a reply to their first draft post so that it's all in one place. That's sort of helpful. And then I use a rubric to grade the peer review work. And that's what I'm looking at here. I don't really care about your draft at all at this point. I care about how well you did the process. So notice that the writer's task, your writer task, you have two rows for the first post and then the review. And then in this case, there were 3 people and they had to review 2 different people. So there's a row for each person, whether or not you said your things to the partner. Very straightforward. Mostly if you do it and it meets the word count and it's on time. So these were really easy to score. It's going to be even easier now in the new version of Moodle because I can see everything one student did in one panel and I'll have the rubric right beside it. That's going to be really nice. So this is the rubric I use to grade the behavior, not the product. After they have done all of this work on their first best try, then they give it to me. This is the magic and the secret, quite frankly, to giving feedback frequently, promptly, and meaningfully to my students is what they get me is a much better draft so that my comments can focus on higher order things that they and their peers don't understand yet, instead of the small things like you totally didn't do the assignment correctly, which all that does is mean start over from scratch again. Their peers can say, wait, I think you were supposed to do this. And they're like, oh, okay, I see. All right, let me fix that before I give it to Robbie. Robbie appreciates that a lot. So the work that I get is way better and I can focus on things that they couldn't have gotten to on their own. In the second pressing, essentially, is sometimes what I call it for them. The first pressing is for your peers. The second pressing is what I get. So then they give me a revised draft for my feedback. And then after I give them feedback on the draft, not a score for how well it meets the criteria, just you did a good job, you turned it to me on time, here are some thoughts for making this better. They take that feedback and apply it to this component part. It kind of just hangs out with that component part while they build the other parts. And then later when they put it all together, they can come back to my feedback, if that makes sense. Once they get all the parts, we work through this process for all of the major component parts, inquiry question, thesis, introductory paragraph, annotated bibliography, full draft, final draft, something like that, right? Think about how your writing assignments chunk out. Once each of those components works through this process, scaffolding and norming. I don't always do norming, but I think it's really formally. Sometimes I just show them models of successful ones and talk about why they're successful. If it's very complex component, I ask them to really engage with some because they understand it better if it has a lot of moving parts. Then they do the peer review on that component, and then they give me a revised draft for feedback, and they hold on to that feedback and use it to make the final product better. Then the very last step, once they got all the little parts, is that they give me the final draft with all the revised parts together. It goes into the Moodle assignment tool, and I can score it. I don't give it feedback, I score it. So I use a rubric, and I provide very minimal feedback or comments on that because they've already had my feedback on all the parts. And my feedback at this point, this comes in at the very end of the semester. They aren't going to have another go at this essay. So my feedback is really minimally helpful, unless it's something where it's like you really don't understand basic citation mechanics, even though we've worked on it a lot. You really want to figure that out before you go to the next class because your teachers are going to expect you to know this. That's the kind of feedback. I almost never have to give that because I have lots of chances through that formative feedback to check if they're off task and to try to remediate or call them in and work with them. So what I end up getting out of this is, like, first of all, my relationship with the student and their work is really different than if I'm grading it all along, because I'm a partner with them in trying to make this paper better. Um, and then when they get all that together, what ends up being the final grade, I give very, very high grades. They tend to be very, very high because the students have had a lot of time to make it great. And they've had my feedback all along, and I've had opportunities to help those students who most need the help, who are really off track. The only time students don't get a good grade is if they don't actually do the work. If they're absent from the process or not participatory in the process through the way, then they haven't benefited from that. And really, it's like they have to at least meet me a third of the way to get this help. And of course, you can reach out to them when they're not participating, but they're the only ones who don't score well are the ones who are low participatory for the process. And it's really true that Phil said, you know, students don't, once they see the score, they don't look at the feedback. So that's one of the best practices, is separate the score from your feedback, because they're really going to look at the score anyway. Let's see. I have a couple of comments here. Carrie says, I may have talked about this. Oh, peer review feedback guidelines. Yeah, I'll make sure that those are posted in Moodle. If they don't show up at the end of the day, feel free to bug me. I'll put them in Moodle either during our downtime in the middle or after the workshop today. And Phil, what share of the grade is the process and what share is the final product? I'm going to shift this up. If I were teaching now in pandemic times, I would shift the weight. But the way I run it now is their final paper, so it's a category in the grade book. It has multiple parts. It's got a draft, it's got a little reflection, it's got some other parts, but that chunk is 50% of their grade. Of course, they have all semester to get it there, right? And so participation, I think, is 20 or 30%. So it's all the process work. I think I call it writing work. All of this process is, 30% of the grade. Could this process be applied to verbal assignments? Yes, I think this process could be applied to any complex performance or product that students will be doing at the end that has component parts, and they need to know, how does this part work, right? I mean, I'm, thinking, like, even for a dance, Jen Camp is here with us, or was here with us. Hopefully she's still here. I can't see her picture in the gallery, but I mean, like, they might need to know a small articulation of the way you move one foot, and eventually it's going to be a whole dance, right? But you have to break it into component parts to give feedback to the small bits, and they need to see that small bit as an isolated unit and then understand how it fits together in the larger whole. That's actually very hard. And if we don't do this sort of scaffolding or chunking, those are used interchangeably, then we're expecting that they will somehow figure out how to parse that themselves and then reintegrate it. And that's very difficult cognitive work. And that's the thing that we happen to be experts in, because we've learned how to do it, and we can mentor them through that process. It levels the playing field for students who maybe don't have that kind of, like, secret understanding of how to win at school. So I highly recommend this process for lots of different things. So thanks for that question. Thanks for all of your good questions. So here's a time for you guys to ask some more questions. I don't know how my time is because I've covered up my clock now, but I'm sure it's good. Okay, we're doing great. So I'm going to stick you guys in breakout rooms, but not for a tremendous amount of time. I'm going to put you there for maybe 8 to 10 minutes. And I'm hoping you can talk about, like, how might you apply some of these ideas about writing. Now, try to hold your discussion forum questions for the second half. We're going to talk about that in a minute. How might you apply these ideas to the writing in your classes? Or maybe you already do, and you found some way to tweak, or there's some problem you can't get through, right? Are there opportunities to chunk and scaffold? How meaningful are your writing assignments currently? And are there any strategies or best practices that you think you want to try to incorporate now? This is sort of just like a save point. I know I keep using that metaphor, but it's really useful. Okay, writing, let's talk about this for a minute. And then after this, when you come back, we'll take a little bio break. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about feedback and scoring, grading, marking, feedback. And then the last part will be discussion forums. So that's kind of where we are in the agenda. Okay, so if you need to come back to see the slides for some of those lists of strategies, the slideshow is posted in the Moodle course. And I'll be hanging out in the Zoom session in case you guys have questions or problems. Okay, let me stop share. There are all your lovely faces again. I'm going to just stick you into breakout rooms randomly. Let's see. Let's see. How about that? Okay. See you guys soon. I'll pop in and check on you.
Our faces are not that lovely. Do we still get to participate?
You know what? All faces are lovely. It's like a magic of design, really, if you think about a face. Don't get me off on a distracted poet tangent because you'll never get me back.
Now, I did have one question in the chat, Robbie, which was when you talked about the where they evaluated their own draft. Was there a form that they could look at? Excuse me, for points. I don't know what I-
When they looked at, or when they looked back at the feedback they got from peers, is that what you mean?
What you called it, what I called it.
It probably was the
Revision plan.
the revision plan.
You know, 'cause
They don't. Yeah, they just basically, it's really a reflection on that process. And so they will have used a rubric very often in their peer review with their partners. They will be talking about a rubric. And so hopefully in that conversation, it's less formal than here's a rubric, mark your own draft against this rubric. I find that they feel like that's kind of homeworky. So I just have them have a conversation with each other with that rubric as like a point of reference. And so often they'll reply back to it, but they just have to sort of basically reflect on, well, what was it like having a conversation with others about your piece and what good advice did you get going
Yeah,
forward?
but they're able to translate that into more specific.
They do really well, I think. I give them, they link off to the guidelines, which I'll put in the Moodle site, just so they can sort of see, here's some kind of key questions to try to answer in that period, in that revision plan step. So
Because what I've found with looking at candidates writing is, know it or not, we all have a kind of template in our own mind of what a correct answer is or what good writing looks like. And for me to sometimes step back and go, oh, how does this person know what they're doing? And like knows here, they just do it differently.
right.
You know, sometimes I'm quick to just, well, they left this out, they left that, but wait a second.
Right.
If it is someone's thinking or someone's voice, you know, sometimes you have to restrain your own judgment and get to know their own.
Right. Well, that's where really clear expectations, like what is it you're really looking for? Are you looking for them to hit very specific points? If so, tell them that so that they can make sure they do it. It looks like Jennifer Jennifer, I just looked at Jennifer Hardiker's face and then I saw Jennifer Antic's name and I squished them together.
I like it. Jennifer Antiker.
Antic, yes.
I like it. No, I was just a quick question of tools, a practical piece. For the peer review, that seems to be difficult in Moodle. So what are you using to, what's the tool, what's the structure within which students are doing peer review, especially for online?
It is a Moodle, and it's a completely, it's asynchronous supported by a synchronous conversation. That's the way I did it.
How can they see each other's uploads?
They put it in a forum, in the discussion forum. They have to upload a file into the discussion forum.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's the discussion forum works seamlessly, and I was teaching in pre-COVID, so we still met face-to-face in class, but I had them post their draft and do an initial response before we saw each other in class. So the student, the reviewers had to have read the submission and made comments before they actually saw each other in class that next day. And
Can other students see their feedback?
Yep. It's all a conversation.
Basic, it's not a special version of the forum.
Nope, just a play. I don't do anything different. It's just forum, basic forum. Leave all the defaults the same.
Okay.
And then I just tell them in the instructions, post your draft. Consider copy pasting and including a link to the file so that your partners can see it really easily. They don't even have to download a file; they can see it. But it's good to include a link to the actual file in case there's a formatting question, because sometimes copy pasting makes the format wonky. But it also helps them focus on content more than, oh my gosh, your margins are like 0.75 instead of 1. I don't want them talking about that yet. So they put the content in and then oh, I really love how you did this. I was a little confused here. I think Robbie said you need a whatever. Can't wait to talk with you about this in class. So if we're not going to have a synchronous time for them to talk to each other, I would probably ask for that review to be a little bigger. Or maybe I would ask them to do an audio comment or a video comment now that that's a tool in the forums that we didn't have before. So it was very easy with the discussion forum in Moodle. It revolutionized the way I teach writing in general once that came online. So I was using that long before we had to. Okay, so why don't we take a quick bio break? Because
I have a question, Robbie.
sure, Jeff.
You know, listening to your description of your writing course, it sounded really good. But it is a writing course.
Right.
It doesn't have other substantive content. I believe strongly in writing across the curriculum. In most of my courses, the students produce 20 to 25 pages of final product, and they probably rewrite 6 or 8 pages of that total. But I don't want them devoting as much time
Right.
to the writing process as you were describing the students in your writing thing, because I want them to spend a lot of time reading a bunch of substantive stuff and being prepared to come to class and talk about that and hear more substantive stuff. And so if I'm only doing a third of the writing process that you're described for your writing class, because my class has a lot of writing, but it's not a writing class, which third would you say is most important for a content-driven class?
So A, that's a really good point that you're making. B, I'm going to give you an answer that might not satisfy you, so forgive me. But what I have to default back to is if we want them to do it and they don't know how to do it when they come to our class, we probably have to teach them how to do it. So if you're asking them to do 25 pages of writing and you expect that writing to be skillful writing, and they come in and don't have writing skill, you either have to accept that the writing will be less skillful than you want, or you have to help them build the skill of writing, if that's critical to your learning outcomes. If it isn't, then you can say that's outside the scope of what I'm trying to do here. And then give yourself permission to let that go. If it is critical to your learning outcomes, then you'll have to find a way to specifically teach those skills that you're going to hold them accountable for if they don't come in having them, unless it's a prereq and you can block them from getting in the class without that skill, right? So, but if I was gonna say, okay, make this simpler, let's do a streamlined version of this, I would say modeling or norming, getting them to see some versions of it that are good and talk about why they're good, and asking them to peer review and give you a chance. And if you're going to give feedback before it's the final grade, because otherwise there's no point. I mean, why would they listen to what you say? You're just then justifying the grade, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So, all right, I think people are back. It's 23. If people come in a little bit later, that's okay. I see 3 questions in the chat. Let me just see what we got here. I just see one. Peer review within Moodle. Carrie's just backing me up. That's awesome. Cool. Okay, I'm going to try to watch this thread as we go. I'm going to go ahead and share, so that in the interest of getting you guys to a lunch break at 1, which we all are going to need to make sure we do. Let me get back into the presentation. I'm still recording, it looks like. If you have questions, I have the chat open. Hopefully I'll see them. If it's burning and I don't see it, please call it out. So here we go. Go ahead and someone give me a thumbs up if you can see what used to be the slide you left off with. What do you think? Fantastic. Excellent, guys. Thank you for your great work, by the way. You guys it's end of summer, a long way in of a lot of work you guys have been doing this summer. So I really appreciate your energy and attention at this point, and I mean that sincerely. So questions, comments, we just talked about those. Grading, scoring, and feedback is a place that a lot of us run aground with our best intentions for writing and using writing and doing more writing, right? I mean, I hear Jeff say, I want them to do writing. They do 25 pages of writing in my class. It's fantastic. And we have maybe ambitious ideas about that. And then we get into the place where we're like, well, if it's going to be meaningful, I have to give them some feedback on it. Or they have to have a chance to grow and develop, use that work to grow and develop. But it's just like time. And that's a real thing. Time is a real component that we have to contend with when we're talking about marking writing. So let's talk just a little bit about some ways that it becomes less efficient, and then let's not do the inefficient things, because it's too much work to have it be inefficient. So conventional, one thing is where we go wrong is I think we just call it grading, which actually is conflating 2 things that are separate, scoring and feedback. Grading and scoring is a communication with the student, really. We're communicating to them something about their performance and their skill acquisition. And so a number or a single letter, if you're just doing a score and no feedback, is really an insufficient way to communicate to them anything meaningful. I was talking with my kids. Actually, I made them sit through a dry run of this. They're good kids. I'm really going to be nice to them this week. I said, you know, actually, when you think about it, just giving a student somewhere between 0 is you didn't do it to 100, you did it. It's almost like, and they're supposed to guess what to do next based on where on that number line their piece has fallen. It's really like a game of hot or colder. And we all know how frustrating that is, right? You're like, just tell me where the damn keys are, because I got to go to do the thing. So we could just tell them where the keys are, right? And then later we can give them scores separately. So hot or colder is a really bad way to help students develop their writing. In summative assessments, most of the time, the feedback serves to justify the grade we've given them, not to guide future performance. And I know that some of us are like, well, I know the student, this is a really hard class, I'm going to have to justify why I didn't give them 100%. Okay. But before that, you want to give them feedback so they shouldn't be surprised by the grade they get. If they understand the product or performance, if they understand the criteria and you've given them some formative feedback, they should not be surprised by the grade they get at the end. Otherwise, something broke down somewhere in that process. The problem with this justifying the grade is they don't have any opportunity to apply what you've said to alter the outcome, which has real impact to their lives and their futures. The score they get and the grade they get from your class matters. It impacts them in real ways. And if you give them feedback after the fact, it's pointless because they can't do anything about it now, right? It just causes sort of a feedback loop of bad feelings. And I found that you can avoid that if you just put the feedback first and then score it later. Teachers, and this is actually the good news, this is the good news, and this comes to efficiency. We mark way too many things. It takes us a long time, it's cognitively exhausting, and it doesn't help students almost at all. We end up slipping, and I say we because that's me, falls into this a lot, and it's very hard for me to work against this, but we fall into editing versus instructing. Our job is not to edit that paper. Our job is to use this performance to instruct or to teach students about how to develop their writing or thinking in our field. If we can remember that, the feedback marking session changes drastically. We're not supposed to edit, because really whether or not the comma is in the right place is pretty insignificant compared to whether or not their thinking is at all tuned in to how they should be thinking in this task in this class. And all of the research, I know this is going to be shocking, people are going to be like, seriously? For real, the research says that students can only attend 2 to 3 major concepts for a single submission. 2 to 3 separate, distant kind of things. If you're going to talk about comma splice, and you want to talk about thesis statement, and you're going to talk about topic sentence, they're maxed out now. You can't also mark word choice and MLA or APA and run-on sentence. That's too much. They can't process all of that. And you're wasting your energy after that. You're putting more ink that just gives them anxiety, and you're losing more time that you could be spending attending your tomato plants. So try not to do that. What that means, though, is that you're going to have to give feedback to multiple different submissions in order to get around all of the things you need to give them conversation about. The other problem with marking too much is there's usually not a separation between the higher order concerns from those lower order ones. Our goal is to help them be better thinkers and to express that thinking in writing very often, if we're talking about online writing, not to make sure that they're perfect with things like grammar and commas, although there's a place for that, but that can be dealt with very quickly in a very focused kind of way. So here's what effective feedback looks like. This is separate from scoring feedback. Then this is information for you to move forward, student. It has to be really clear. This goes back, if they can't read your handwriting, I am super guilty of this, then there's no point in you having written it in the first place. They don't know what you just wrote there. They don't know how this relates. If they don't understand your comment, then there's no communication happening there. if it's not targeted very specifically to a skill and they know what that skill is and they can tell by your feedback what you're talking about, then it's not effective. It needs to be prompt. It has to happen soon after the performance. And that's hard. We all have crazy busy lives, right? Which is why you can't go through and line edit 15 pages and turn that around the next day or even the next week. Smaller, shorter assignments, very focused feedback. Do that more frequently. It yields much better writing. Your feedback needs to guide some future performance. This guy, Marshall Goldsmith, it's actually quoted in the book Flash Feedback, which is linked in the Moodle course. Think about it as feed forward instead of feedback, because what we're trying to do is help them next time they do this. And if it's too late into the semester, what's the point? Really, you want to try to separate the feedback from a score or a grade, because they're always going to look at the thing that hurts them the most, or that's the most risk for them. And that's, what is my grade? Not, what do I need to do to get a better grade? Jennifer Antic has a comment here. They may only have one submission for each document, and all of it needs to be cleaned up. That's where, if each of those submissions is a final draft, is there any way at all to get them some feedback before the final draft? Even if it's just asking, putting them in peer groups and having them run it by a peer. This is what we do as professional writers in the world. I don't know about you guys, but I never put anything out in the public. I never publish anything publicly unless I've had a trusted friend look over it, read through it, lots of times actually. We want to, even in professional programs especially, that's a skill we would want to train in them. You should run this by a trusted peer, and we can structure that scaffolding in our classes by making it an assignment. Better if you can look at it, but if you can't, at the very least, get somebody else's eyes over it. This falls back to that there needs to be interaction at some point in the process between assignment and submission, right? So hopefully that would be helpful. Lots of great strategies about feedback. I could have done the whole workshop just about feedback, guys. So I'm sorry if I give you a lot. So I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed. These are all linked in the Moodle site. Our friend John Bean, in his Engaging Ideas book, has lots of good ideas for this. Elizabeth Tavares, sadly not at Pacific anymore, but while she was here, she did a presentation for us, and we wrote a teaching profile for her. It's on our SETSI webpage. That's linked in the course. She teaches writing. How does she manage all of that writing and feedback? So she has some tips there if you want to visit that page. And then a book that I just encountered, I'm almost finished reading it. I'm like on the last chapter, called Flash Feedback. If you can see my picture, I don't know if you can, but here's the book. It's got a really nice cover. Flash Feedback. Matthew Johnson is the writer. He teaches actually high school English, K-12. Here's, some of you might be like, I teach professionals at the graduate level. Why do I want to hear what a K-12 English teacher has to say? Here's why. Because they have like 150 or 200 really grumpy, mostly recalcitrant teenagers that they have to teach. And they have the most rigorous expectations, millions minutia of things they have to do. The constraints are crazy for K-12 teachers, especially high school teachers. And so every strategy they have is maximally efficient and quick. They just don't have time to do anything that's not perfectly efficient. So here are some tools, some ways that you can give feedback, aside from writing in the margins, although I'll talk about that at the end. You could use Word track changes or a Google Doc. I don't really recommend track changes it doesn't work for me because you have to download a file and save it again with a different name and then make comments and then upload it again. There's just a lot of manipulating of files, and that to me is very tedious. So I don't personally like that way. You can leave comments in Google Docs, which is actually pretty great. And that's what Matthew Johnson actually does himself and recommends for feedback on drafts, because you can just make comments in the margins, you can make inline comments, and the doc is sort of a living thing then that you and the student are in together all the time. I think that's pretty helpful. You can use the Moodle assignment tool to make comments. This is essentially a comment bubble. The Moodle assignment tool lets you, basically becomes an annotated PDF. Whatever the student's upload is becomes an annotated PDF. Some people have reported that those comments are in an odd location, or sometimes they block the text. So not everybody has loved that, but some people do. And you can save your comments in a quick list, which is kind of helpful. You can use a screencasting software to do video feedback. So you open this student submission on your computer and start Screencast-O-Matic or some screencasting tool and talk through it. This is something that Mark Szymanski with College of Ed does. Says it works really well for him. He just puts those into a Google folder. If you guys want more information offline, I can talk to you about his process there. You could always do digital handwritten comments using annotation apps. So some things like Notability or GoodNotes. Phil uses GoodNotes, I believe, right, Phil? You would need an iPad or a tablet and some sort of stylus, and you could actually just write comments in the margins by hand, and it saves as a PDF, and you upload that to the student. That requires hardware and software, but that's another way. If just writing on it is what you have to do, that might be a way to do it. I'm having a lot of fun with my new iPad, so that's something I might try when I teach again. So in terms of feedback in general, Moodle's rubric tool is really, really useful, and I think it's a critical tool for us in this LMS. So it's available in the assignment tool now, and after the upgrade on the 25th, it will be in the discussion forum, which is going to be a game changer, I think. You can build a rubric from scratch, or you can use any existing template in the database, including your own rubrics. That if any class that you're a teacher in, you can access any of those rubrics. They'll come up as options when you search for your own rubrics. So once you build it, it's built and you can reuse it. And SETC, any member of the SETC team can make any rubric into a template. So if you guys in your team or your department, or somebody you know has a really great template and you want it to be available for everybody to use, just let us know. And we can mark that as a template, and it will show up for anybody on the system. All users can see that as one of the options for a template. Right now, when you do it, you'll see there's a bunch of them because I've made a bunch of them templates. I'll probably pull some of those out because a lot of that was for testing. So Jennifer Antic says, how do I feel about box notes if you use a box folder uploading? I think it's good. I think it's probably similar. I haven't used that very much, but if you have sort of secure documents that you have to push through Box that wouldn't be appropriate to put in Google, then by all means, yeah, anything that lets you comment in the margins on a piece of writing or a document will probably get you there. Rubrics will remain attached to any assignment that you build, even after you duplicate it. So you can build the assignment, attach the rubric, build out that rubric, and then later you can duplicate that within that class or even import it to another class. And you've got it built. So there's some work in building it in the first place, but then it exists for you as a resource electronically in the Moodle world, which is really helpful. You can grade an assignment and also give feedback simultaneously, really just by clicking cells of a matrix. You'll have an empty cell on each row, each criterion row, for additional feedback if you need to give some specific, this is why. There's a little extra thing I need to say to you here. That's always available. You don't have to use that if you don't want to, but you do have the chance to actually give a little bit of guided feedback there. So now I'm just going to show you, I'm going to demo really quickly how easy it is to make a rubric in Moodle. If I can move this. Oh, my mouse is frozen. That's nice. There we go. Okay, so let me do a new share. Hopefully, I'm blocking my own screen here. Okay. Let's see. Can you guys see the SETC Summer Retreat series? You guys see this here? I might need you to say it out loud because for some reason I've lost all your faces. Here we go.
No, I see your
Right now I see
Email.
My email, of course you
yeah.
do. Let me try again. I'll just bring it down. How about now?
Now I see a Moodle page.
Excellent. Okay, thanks guys. As you guys have probably experienced, once you switch things around, Yeah, you'll lose. Yeah, this is my desktop. That's good. That's what I wanted. So mostly I just want you to see this Moodle course. So you just have to turn editing on like everything else. Like anything else you want to do. Hopefully it will actually go. There we go. Okay, let me move your lovely faces elsewhere. So to any section, you can add an activity or resource. I'm going to add an assignment tool. So if you don't know how to do assignments or forums, see me offline and I'll catch you up to speed. But I think most everybody here knows how to do that. So I don't want to take a lot of time from this workshop to talk about the ins and outs of building these tools or adding these tools. But assignment tool, add, Moodle will make me give it a title. This is where you could put instructions. You can add a file with anything. If you have an overview of the assignment or models, examples, you can put them here. Most important thing you're going to come down here is grade. And the points are whatever they would be. This is the line here, grading method. Instead of simple direct grading, which is the default, you're going to set to rubric. And then you save and display. The assignment will stop you and say, wait, you said you wanted a rubric. Like, yes, I do. Let me show you how to do one from scratch. Here's my best tip ever. Give your rubric a really clear, distinct name, so that when you search for it, you can find it again. It's sometimes helpful to also include some information about what course it's for or what assignment it's for. The more information you put here, the easier it is to find it when you're searching later. So what you get here is this builder that starts with criterion and then the levels of performance. You can add more levels if you want. So let's just do this. And then you have to say something about the level. I'm not going to uppercase, even though it's going to drive myself crazy. No, I can't do that. Sorry. Hold on. This is what I often do. And then I'll add a level 2. Exceeds. And let's just say these are the point values. Moodle will do the math. If you said the assignment's worth 100 points, it will just figure it out magically to somehow make 3 points, 3 points, 3 points equal 100%. I don't know how Moodle does it. What I try to do, though, it's clearest to students, if your assignment is worth 100 points, to make the total maximum somehow equal 100 points, and then go down. Often, my does not meet is a 0%. My meets low, this is a little bit of my rubric workshop here. My meets low is usually 75% maybe, or 70. Meets high is 90, so it's a basic A, lowest possible A, and exceeds would be 100. So that has worked well for me and my students. So I lay that all out, and then I can duplicate this row and then just change the criterion. Now, if you want to actually add a description, so this actually, let's change this to say something like, content execution. You might have other things like organization, whatever you have here, it doesn't matter. What is the criterion that you're trying to evaluate, and what are the levels of performance look like? So we're just going to leave it as that. You could just keep adding. My advice is to go ahead and fill out your labels for your levels of performance if they're going to be the same, and then duplicate each row so that you don't have to type this all in again and do the numbers again. Sometimes your first row might be worth, like, I don't know, the maximum possibility is maybe, let's see, I said it was 100 points, right? So let's just say 60, in which case I would make this one worth 60 points if you got 100, and then you just do the math back down. I'm not going to do that now, but you guys could do that math. 90% of 60, what is that, 50? I'm not going to do the math because you're going to see how bad I am at math. And then this one maybe would be 40 if the execution is slightly less important than content, right? Sorry, I don't want to get lost in rubric theory because that's a whole other workshop here.
We have accounting people here that can help us with the math.
Yeah, well, that's good. Just don't make me look bad. Okay, I'm looking up at the picture of your faces up here, so it would make me look less bad, maybe. Okay, anyway, you get it. The idea. The exceeds column, which is 100%, should equal your total point value. That makes most sense to students. So let's see. Okay, I build it all out. Okay, I'm all done. You probably want to say save and make ready unless you're going to still keep changing it. Let's just say save and make it ready. Now I can use it to grade if I wanted. So let me add myself into this course as a student, give myself the student role if I can find myself where I might be. Here I am. Let me make myself a student really quick. I highly recommend doing this to all of your classes so that you can see what it looks like from both perspectives. I'm going to go back to that assignment. And so here's the assignment test. If I'm a student and I want to upload, I have to scroll past the rubric before I can even upload by a submission. Let's just say, I don't think I actually said upload. Did I say upload? Okay, well, I don't know what I have for a file here. Oops, that's not what I want to do. I can just very simply drag and drop. There you go. My assignment. Save the changes eventually. I have to put something in so that you can see how. Oh, it's still uploading. It's taking forever. Okay. So now you can see that there's assignment in there. Eventually it's going to save. My Wi-Fi is going slow. And then if I want to grade them, I will see this submission eventually. It's going slowly. I believe it's still loading. This is interesting. It should be rendering. Let's pretend like it rendered here. Okay, it should be rendering. I can look at the assignment here, or I could download it from here. And then I could just give Robbie a really good score because she worked really hard on this, I can tell.
And this is assignment, not forum, correct?
Right, this is the assignment tool. I could click on the thing to download it if I needed to here. So this is the thing to note. It should render here. I'm not sure why it's not right now. It's probably my Wi-Fi speed. But it's also here, so I could always download the file. The file they upload will always be downloadable, and I could look at it there. I could give them a couple of comments and then save and show the next. So the rubric is attached. Now if I duplicate this assignment, this rubric will come along. Oh, hey, there it is. Those are my notes for this workshop, actually, that I made on my brand new iPad. I'm unjustifiably proud of that. So this is the basic process of how you build a rubric. And it's exactly the same process for making a rubric in the discussion tool, which you'll get as of Sunday the 25th. So you can make it as, if you have one already written out in Word, you can't import it, but you can look at it and then transpose it. You can type it in or even copy paste. Sometimes the format gets a little wonky, but usually it's not too bad. So that's the basic demo of, let me just go ahead and stop the share instead of doing a new share. The demo for how to do a rubric. Let's see, what did I have next? Okay, let's pause for questions if you guys have questions at this point about that feedback, specifically rubrics. Sorry, discussion forums are next. My brain's ready to go there. Do you guys have any questions? We just have a little bit more before I'm going to give us the break, but actually I'm coming in under noon, so that's pretty good. You guys have comments, questions, concerns at this point? Oh, do you want to see, you guys can just do thumbs up, yes or no, or just say yes or no. Do you want to see how to add a rubric from a template? Actually, I should probably show you that. It only takes a minute. Let me show you that too. That really will be helpful. And then think of your questions while we do this. Let's see. Hopefully this will work. Are you guys seeing my desktop again, what we were just looking at before my assignment? Thanks, Paul. Great. Let's go back here. I'm just going to make a new assignment. Actually, I'll duplicate this one and just change the rubric. That will be useful information for you. So you can duplicate anything in Moodle with this little edit arrow over here. Edit, duplicate. So now it's exactly the identical assignment as the first one, maybe. I'm going to go ahead and edit it so that I can change the rubric that's on there. So you could edit it this way. You can go back to grade. Oh, actually, I don't think you can edit it this way. Sorry. Don't tell Al. You'll get fired. You have to actually, that's not true. I won't get fired. So you have to actually click on the assignment itself, and then you have a different editing gear here. That's a secret I forget often. Now you can go down to define rubric. So you click on the assignment itself to get into it, and then you click on the editing gear up in the top corner and go to define the rubric, because we're going to change this rubric here. So here's where you could edit it if you wanted to edit it. If what you want to do is take it out entirely and put a new one in, you go to advanced grading. So it's just one screen before. It's like one level before. Advanced grading is back here where you can use this one. You guys won't see this button to publish it as a template, only administrators will see that. But I could delete this one. Let's just get rid of it. I don't want to use that rubric anymore. Yep, I'm sure. And then you could create one from a template. You can, when you don't have a rubric attached, but you told Moodle that you want to use a rubric, it will give you these two options. Let's create one from a template. Now, you will see, this is Elizabeth Tavares' template. There are lots and lots of templates in here for all kinds of different assignments, right? This was like a public, like a, for, oh, Ramona, help me, what is it called? Civic engagement course, sorry. Never mind, Ramona. This was a discussion forum rubric. I believe this one comes from Don Schweitzer. He talked about that on Tuesday. So they're all in here. I could use any of these. Let's just use Don's. So you'll get to this little checkbox. You won't see delete because that's only for administrators, but you'll click on the green checkbox to use the template you found. And then you could say continue. If you wanted to search for your own templates, you can click include my own forms. And then you could say, I don't know, maybe we'll get something from that. Oh, there you go. Generic grading rubric, Robbie's version. Anything with the word Robbie in it comes down, right? So let's just use this one. And then this is the rubric you'll get. Brilliantly on Moodle's part, you have the option to edit it if you wanted to tweak it a little bit. And then the whole thing is fully editable. Okay, so that's how you'll either create from scratch or use a template. Okay, let's go ahead and save it. If you say save as a draft, you won't be able to use it to grade. That's important to note. So if you're like, why am I not seeing my rubric? It might be that you saved it as a draft instead of made it ready. Okay, so let's stop the share for a second, and then I'm going to go back to my presentation while you guys see if you have questions. It's okay if you don't. I'm happy to keep going, but I don't want to overrun somebody who is trying to, grapple with an idea or has a burning question. Also, like, silence is tricky for me, so Carrie and I understand this. We understand each other around this. I think she stepped out, but okay, I'm going to watch the chat. If a question comes to you, just pop it right in. Can you guys see my slide share again? Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. Super. Okay, so we're just going to talk about online discussion forums. This is not as long as the online writing because everything we've talked about writing in some way has some bearing on discussion forums. So remember, they're a tool, just like a Word doc is a tool. It's not actually what's in it is the thing to think about. And the constraints of the tool push on that a little in the same way that you might pick an Excel sheet over a table in Word because you understand the differences of the constraints of those tools. But that you'll first think about what it is you're trying to build or trying to do with that tool. And that's what we should do with online discussions too. There are lots and lots of ways to use this tool besides discussion. You can use a forum that's just for operations, like questions about the syllabus or due dates. I call this the help forum. Sometimes people call it a Q&A forum. And it functions very similarly to the assignment forum in terms of purpose in my class, except the the announcement forum, as you guys all know, is one-way communication. The instructor can communicate to students and then they get a copy sent to their email, but they can't reply in that forum or post in that forum. So an operations forum or help forum or Q&A forum is students and instructor can both post and reply in that forum. So that's one really useful way to use the tool that really isn't an academic use, perhaps. It's more operations. You can set up a forum that's specifically to to boost social interaction or to serve a social purpose, especially in online classes or hybrid distance classes. That social component is important, and a forum can be really supportive of that kind of interaction with them. It can be really useful for sharing of resources. Now you have the announcements forum where you can share resources, or you can post in the Moodle course to share resources. But students often have resources that they want or need to share, and making it a forum just for that is useful, or wrapping that functionality into the operations forum can sometimes work. It's really useful if you're asking students to create or curate content, especially multimedia content. A forum is a perfect container for that, a receptacle for that. It's really useful tool for any writing to learn activities like preflections, reflections. This is all Carrie, and Carrie's not here, but Carrie she's doing right now in her course, a preflection, reflection with her students. The preflection they actually do as an exit ticket at the end of a synchronous class. They're not face-to-face, it's an online class, but the end of the thing, they've wrapped up one topic. Before they leave that class, they have to post in the forum about here's the new, she sort of previews the next topic and says, all right, what do you know about this topic? So it's really that very basic sort of cognitive practice of accessing prior knowledge and sort of scanning your own schema for what you know about this topic already. She's dealing with graduate students. And so sometimes they're pretty, they can have low tolerance for being taught something they think they already know. So this was a way for her to give them a chance to say, do you already know everything there is to know about this? Well, look at that. You can tell me that you already know. And then after they encounter the content that week, they go back and reflect about, oh, I needed to review that. Or it turns out I was really solid on that and I was able to save some time because I didn't have to read that in depth. Whatever, it's been really useful for her. Some other writing to learn activities are real reading responses and metacognitive activities. All of that kind of thing where the writing is meant to help them learn, not to demonstrate their learning. And it's also really useful for discussions. This is the one thing we tend to think about, but look at, it's only like 1/6 of this list. And I think that's important to note. Socratic style sort of discussions that simulate in-person synchronous oral discussion. But as Phil helped us to see early on, it's not exactly the same as a spontaneous, in the moment oral discussion. It won't be, because there's the element of time. And because there's this question of composition. When we're speaking freely, extemporaneously with people, we have to compose or we couldn't speak, but that is not usually a conscious, careful composition of expression, unless we direct students to do that, which I also recommend in a face-to-face discussion. But this is going to have a delay of time, and also often the artificial layer of respond to two people. That's not usually what we do in a synchronous oral discussion, a spontaneous discussion. We don't say, all right, everybody say your thing, we'll go around. Now, each of you reply to two other people. We just don't do that. It feels artificial, which I think is part of the reason why students resist doing that. It feels tedious to them because it's artificial to a discussion in that way. So we'll talk about some best practices to get at some of this now. But these are important things to, like, framing thoughts as we go into this part here. So brilliant article. If you don't read anything else about discussion forums, this is the article to read it. You may have seen it. I think it's in the FLC stuff if you're also a member of the FLC. So you may have read this already, but I keep coming back and back to it because it's got some really great tools in it, charts and examples and samples and things. So I like this article a lot. And it's basically sort of like a lit review or a collective of a lot of different research that they put all together for us in one place, which is really helpful. I appreciate that a lot. So they review strategies for communicating. These are like the main things they say you should do. This is kind of the categories of best practice. Communicating the purpose of the discussion. Why are you even asking students to do this? And what do you expect in terms of response? Is it okay for them to go like, LOL, bro, that was so funny, I so get that. If that's okay, then let them know that. If you want them to compose multi-paragraph responses to each other, you need to tell them that that's your expectation too. Because it's in some ways, online forums simulate a kind of textual exchange that they do very informally in their life all the time. All of us are texting all the time, and that's a dialogic kind of text-based communication. And the setup of discussion forums sort of simulates that. So they fall into some of those patterns. If we don't want them to be really informal, it's important to let them know what our expectations are. We should set up a structure for that discussion. And there's more about this in a second. We want to create effective question prompts. I think sometimes when the discussion is not energetic in our discussion forums, it's because the prompt doesn't either allow room for that, or it certainly doesn't elicit that kind of interchange. And then strategies for facilitating that discussion. How can we intercede in ways that are productive for that discussion? So a key feature of this article is they have a summary table with all of these strategies by category, with like the specific strategy hyperlinked to their references list for where they got that. These people did their homework. It's really great. They also have, I think they have some rubrics, they have really great lists of Socratic questions you can use. I love this. It's like a handbook, a little handbook. Before we go to the next slide, Teresa Fairfield says, how might these different purposes be represented? Operations in one thread at the top of the course, social each week? Yeah, so I can answer that a little bit, but it also depends on what you need in your class. I tend to have right under the announcements forum, which is the one-way communication, just announcements really, I have what I call my help forum, but that's the operations forum. And it lives at the top of the course. And there's just one of those. And people post questions, or if they have a resource, or they can answer the question somebody asked, then that's where that happens. And I only need one of those. You might only need one social, which is also like a coffee shop place. And you only need one of those, and you direct students back there or try to get them to go back there. Things like preflection, reflection, if you're asking them to do that for each module, then you probably would want one of those in each module. So sort of thing, right? So it's like what the purpose of the forum is. The great thing about like something that's a recurring feature, like a preflection, reflection, or a discussion question for the reading, you can make it once and put all the parameters and the rubric and the instructions and the deadlines, and then you just duplicate that down and change the title. It's really helpful. Maybe change the dates. This is really helpful article, and it talks about this a little. There's another article I'm going to talk about in just a minute, like the third slide, the third one in, that talks specifically about ways to use this different types of forums that this woman uses in her courses. So I'm going to break out Ohlone and Harrington just a teeny bit because they have good strategies that we want to look at. So to try to communicate the purpose and expectation, talk about why it's important. This is basic transparent teaching, but why is it important that they participate in this forum? How is it going to help them? How is it going to achieve learning goals? And they have it's fair for them to ask why. You can make them seem important because it counts for a moderate percentage of that final grade. And they define that moderate, I think, as 10 to 20%. I think I have another slide about that in a minute. Provide a rubric with expectations so that's the purpose and the expectation is really clear. For posts and responses, we're usually pretty good about making sure we tell them what we want in the post, but we don't always clarify what we want in the responses. I suspect sometimes, at least in my case, because I didn't really know what I wanted. And I had to think about what really does I would see it and I'd be like, well, that's a crap response. I'm like, well, did you tell them what counts as good and what counts as crap response? Because if you didn't tell them what a crap response looks like, they aren't going to know that that's how you're going to feel about that. So you got to be clear with them. Structuring this discussion. This was really useful and something I hadn't thought about very much until I got into the research, or I hadn't thought about it specifically. Structuring the discussion really matters. This I do, like multiple deadlines. So the initial post by Wednesday, follow up by Sunday. Al does that in the FLC if you're participating in that. It really helps so that everybody gets their first thought in. And then if you're asking people to interact with other people's thoughts, there needs to be something there for them to interact with. And if you don't set that first deadline, they often will just be jumbling it all at the end, and it's not meaningful discussion. It's just sort of checking off homework boxes then. This is going to be controversial, so hold on to your hats, everybody. Allowing students to see other posts before they post. I know, I'm just watching the chat because I'm expecting it's going to explode right now. You'll be like, what? No, I don't want that. I was surprised, as were Ohlone and Harrington, when they said the research has asked this question specifically, and it has come back that students have better performance, they have more meaningful comments, they interact, they engage more fully when they can see other students' posts. Now, when this doesn't work is when the question prompt has a clear right or wrong answer. If it's a clear right or wrong answer, they just have to see the one person. If it's the kind of thing, this is sort of a litmus test, I think. If it's possible that all the students would have the same response, then maybe you want to look again at that prompt and make a prompt that doesn't have just one response. It also helps students who are more underrepresented or at risk. All of this research that sort of suggests let them see a model and give them a chance to see how others are doing it before they jump in with their voice. I think that it's really helpful. And it also doesn't feel like a game, like the teacher is trying, they don't trust you. I don't trust you to really do the real work. I think you're going to copy. You know what I mean? And that kind of adversarial, even if it's very subtle, can be very difficult to overcome in a class if you want them to trust you and actually have free conversation. In a real conversation, we get to hear what other people say. We would be really unsure about joining a conversation if we haven't heard anything else that's been happening in that conversation. I don't want to look like a dork. I don't want to look like a jerk. I don't want to come in and say something that somebody else said better than me or different than me. Or, I mean, I want to know what the conversation is before I join. And I think that that's where this comment is coming from. And Brandon asked the question, do you need to recommend always requiring follow-up responses? No, not at all. You only need to do that if that's what's going to serve your learning goals. If you want them to have that conversation in class, in online asynchronously, then if you want conversation to happen, you have to prompt them to talk to each other, hopefully. But if you're going to also have a synchronous session, then maybe that's where they open it up. That's a good point. So this was a little thing that I hadn't thought of, but that in truth, once you get going, especially if you have a lot of students, really helps. Get them to label their posts, which is like the subject line. Like, who is posting? Why are you posting? Is this a reply to somebody else's post? What is your thought? So just that almost, I think it's synonymous with, or it's similar to like naming conventions on files that they submit. It's just helpful for organizational purposes and to track the theme, the flow of the conversation. Separate forums for different purposes. We talked about that, and I have another article that I will talk a little bit more about that. They actually, the research suggested that you could do alternative structures like discussion maps instead of a standard threaded discussion. And they recommended using the tool Mindomo, which is basically a mind mapping tool, but multiple people can add to that at the same time. I haven't tried that. Seems kind of fun. The key point, though, being to try different ways to what kind of thinking do you want them to do? And if you want clustered thinking, then maybe a linear form isn't the best tool to get that. And Mindomo is more clustery. This is a key. And I usually teach small classes, but I have my students in partners, so they're really having conversation in a small group of 3 people asynchronously in the forum. So this advice was to divide students into small discussion groups. If you have a very large class, I think that's really helpful. And you can change those groups up if you want. But I mean, Phil could speak much more about the benefit of putting students in persistent groups, and they build relationships and they get invested in each other's learning in a way that they wouldn't if it's just like, oh, there are 50 people in this class, I have to find 2 posts and then get done with this homework assignment. Instead, it's like, okay, what did Javier say today? Or let me go in and see what he said, and I'm going to have a conversation with a person that I know, which is rather than having a conversation with a post. I think that's really helpful. Question prompts is really key, and I think this is something I definitely need to grow in. You want to target, this is for Carrie, who's also not here. Carrie, you're watching the video. I hope you see this. Target Bloom's highest levels of critical thinking in the questions. And again, this article has sample questions. I would just direct you to them better than ones I could make up off the top of my head. But you're going to ask them to do those verbs: integrate, evaluate, like more than summarize. You want to get them doing something that requires them to think divergently rather than convergently. Using some media in those prompts can make them a lot more fun for people to interact with and more engaging. And actually, that's maybe exactly, they need to watch the TED Talk and then they need to reply to this. Just remember that you can, because that's easy with the digital space. They recommend maybe considering role-playing, web quests, debates, other kinds of prompts that get them to thinking in different ways. Again, this all goes back to how do you need them to think? And then make a question that will make them think that way. Last point that they make is some strategies for facilitating that discussion. So that's like, okay, I've made my discussion. I got a great prompt. I gave instructions. I got all the other stuff. Now what do I do? Do I just wait until it's done and then grade it? What do I do? How do I intercede, or how do I where do I come in, and how do I need to do that in a way to keep the conversation going? Participating does increase your presence in a fully online course. That's really important. And they need to know you're in there. But the research suggests that moderate participation is much better than over participating or under participating. If you over participate, essentially they're just really communicating with you technically. They're all posting to the forum, but they know you're going to read and comment on every one of those. So then it becomes a public communication between you and each single student, instead of a communication among students. They put in this number, 125 to 265 posts a semester. I don't know the contextual points of frames of reference for that number. And the number makes me a little nervous, but I'm a poet and numbers make me nervous. So the idea was moderate, whatever that looks like in your course. You don't want to reply to every single post, because that just doesn't work. And if you're not in there at all, then they're like, why should we bother doing a good job? Because I don't think that she's even looking, or he's even looking. Brandon has a question. I'm going to actually go ahead and look at your question after I finish this slide, Brandon, if that's okay. One of the other things you can do is point out themes that are happening. Oh, I'm noticing that everyone is talking about X, Y, Z, or I see that this keeps coming up. This is interesting. Here's a resource, or this researcher also talks about that. Good job, guys. You can highlight posts that are particularly insightful or that move the conversation forward or in a new way. You probably want to correct inaccurate posts, but you want to do that in not a way that shuts down the conversation or that particular student. Another thing that's really, really useful at the end is to summarize the conversation in one post, or you might do that in a little video that wraps up the module or something. But basically that they know you looked at the whole thing, and that it's like a so what? So what about this big conversation? Here's how all the stuff you guys did here helps us propel forward into the next part of our class or the next thing we're working on. You can assign students roles. I haven't had a ton of luck with this, but other people have. Brett Johnson, who teaches English, likes to do roles with students, and he says that seems to work really well. I don't know, Phil, do you use roles with your students in your team-based learning?
I do not.
It's just like a rotating, anybody is going to end up being the reporter, so you just be ready kind of thing.
Yeah, I have that reporting duty assigned randomly at the end, so
Right.
the students have to be engaged during.
Yeah, so that works, I think, pretty differently. Not that that isn't equally effective, but it's different than where they know before the discussion starts, they're going to be the starter. Their job is to continue to start the conversation. And maybe this is in a small group of 4 to 6 students who are in in a discussion group together. One person is going to be the starter. They have to post first. One student's job is to be a skeptic. Another student's job is to wrap up. So it seems like we all said this, maybe, I don't know.
I like those roles a lot better than what you see in some collaborative learning where somebody's the recorder and those roles make sense to me.
Well, this is why I picked these 3 out. There were some others listed in the research that I was like, I don't think I like that. So I just picked the 3 I liked. So this is what happens when you get Robbie's super summary. You also get Robbie's biases, sorry. But you can look at the article yourselves and sift through and pull what you like. To facilitate the discussion, you can come in to the conversation that's already happening and ask a Socratic question that would be open-ended and could get people thinking deeply or more divergently or in some other way. And also it's good, they recommended, to teach students how to ask Socratic questions. So their responses are actually more questions that could then propel the conversation forward. So I thought that was interesting. But again, if it's a thing you want them to do and they don't already know how to do it, you're going to have to teach them to do it, which is maybe burdensome. But it's either you have to do that or you have to let it go. I think that's unfortunately often the decision we have to make in our classes. And it's okay to decide to let it go, but Socratic questions were really helpful to keep the conversation moving along. Okay, so Brandon, I told you I would answer your question. Brandon's question, in case you can't see the chat: if you separate the class into small discussion groups, how do you recommend sharing ideas you see as the course instructor between the groups so students don't feel like they missed something discussed in the other teams? Here's what I do. I use one forum, but they're in discussion pods, so they know who they have to respond to, but their responses are happening within a context of a single discussion. So that works really well for me and my students because everybody can see all the conversations, but they know very clearly who they're responsible for responding to. So it's just one forum, and you're just like a separate, like there's like, I just take a screenshot of, this is your group. This is your group. You know who your people are. Sally, you're responding to Lupita. Lupita, you're in the same group with Dane. You guys all have to reply to each other. And then they know who they have to reply to. But they can see everybody else's discussion. So it's one common discussion, and you can post to the whole group. In the discussion forum, you can also pin a discussion to the top. I don't know that I would do this, but you could pin your own comment at the top, which of course does kind of make you the boss of the discussion, which is probably what you're trying not to do. So, and if you wanted to, the whole summarizing the whole discussion idea is something you might do, but like a small video and post that into the class or send that in the announcement tool or something like that. That could be a good way to wrap it up in the end and make sure they all see it. Cool. Okay, so this other article, so there were 3 articles I was going to talk about. These others much more briefly than the first one. Woods and Bliss talked specifically just about facilitating that discussion, not about setting up so much, but how to keep it going. And so discussion questions was a key focus in their research, and what makes an effective discussion question. Notice how often the word student shows up here. That the students could maybe even create the discussion question. That could be an assignment. You're required to come up with a discussion question this week. And they have to rotate, or they crowdsource them, and then you upvote the one that you're going to talk about, or the 3 that you're going to talk about. Giving students a choice about 3 prompts to look at, it can be really helpful. So you can see this graphic. I'll let you read that on your own. But this is in the article that you'll read if you want to in Moodle. But you can sort of see how a lot of these same themes seem similar to what we've been talking about all day, and in fact, all summer. Specific strategies to get more engagement. This was the focus. Good questions. You might have your questions be flexible and varied. If it's the same exact thing, same exact kind of question every week, it feels like homework and not like an authentic, organic discussion. So the questions that are at the end of chapters in textbooks tend to be very similar. Like it feels like homework at the end of the chapter. And that's something you probably want to avoid if you want organic conversation to happen in your forums. So you want to be flexible in being able to change those things out as the conversation through the semester moves in directions. So it might be good to have a bank of questions that you could bring in. Or if students have a different thing they'd rather talk about, I think it might be really good to go with that. I see your question, Jennifer. I'm going to come right back to it at the end of this slide, if that's okay. Procrastination is the key problem, right? Maybe they did a bad job of replying and interacting because they waited till the last minute and they don't have time to think carefully about it. Deadlines help with this. Scaffolding, remember, Jeff, how I said they use the word scaffolding in lots of places to mean lots of different things? I think some of that is what I would call chunking, breaking it into parts. Some of it might mean that you give them guidelines for how to reply. Address these key questions in your response kind of thing. So that's a scaffolding tool to help them structure their thinking. Making sure those topics are actually interesting and meaningful to students. They don't want to talk about what they don't want to talk about. It's really true. None of us do. Trying to get them to reflect and think critically. These researchers recommended teaching them a little bit about how to do reflective practice before they have to do it in the forums. So maybe a small assignment where you just talk a little bit about what does reflective practice look like, and here's an example of it. Use a bunch of different kinds of discussion formats. So Jennifer asked, how much detail do I include in the syllabus about what? Do you want to come on with your mic real quick?
Sure. I was just thinking of all of these little tidbits, and it's more of a general question. Our syllabi got longer and longer and longer, and we finally recently have just linked them to a bunch of policies. So they're actually a readable document again. But in the, the grading, all the various types of discussions, I'm just curious how much detail you include in there, because there's so much that's going to be in the Moodle page.
Right. I lean very heavily on the Moodle page. The Moodle page becomes an interactive syllabus, really. And so I only put on the syllabus what would be sort of like a handbook. I do give a syllabus workshop, and in that syllabus, a motivational syllabus. And one of the researchers that we looked at in that first article, Harrington, she's got a whole book about motivational syllabus. And she actually recommends the model that she shows is a 23-page document that includes full instructions and full rubrics for all of the most important assignments that carry the heaviest weight. So it really becomes a user's manual to the course.
The syllabi is then quite detailed.
Her syllabus is a user's manual.
And for you?
For me, I kind of did a hybrid. I did a like an oversheet that's really almost like a one-sheeter as the top one with all the most important things. So if students ripped that off and stuck that on the wall, they would have the most important information, almost like an infographic. It was an infographic, actually. The first page is an infographic sheet, syllabus at a glance. And then I made a more substantial document that was maybe 6 pages, 5, 6 pages, maybe not even that long. So I think that most of this is going to be in Moodle. And I actually did a lot of Moodle books that were operations kinds of books. So here's how the workshop forum works. Here are how these other sorts of things work. And they can find more of that in the Moodle course. So I put most of it into the Moodle course, honestly, and direct students to the Moodle course for it. What I put in the rubric, I'm sorry, not the rubric, what I put in the syllabus is what accreditors would need to see, mostly.
Right, so in terms of these discussions, the level of detail in a syllabus might be equivalent to or less detailed than what you have in Moodle.
Much less detailed in the syllabus. I would just say this is discussion forums or workshop forums or discussions are a part of your grade.
Gotcha.
And they account for this percentage. See Moodle for details. Or see the Moodle book, which will talk all about Writer's Workshop and the forums that are there, kind of thing. A playlist model for threads that threads all activities. That's interesting. If you have an example of that, Teresa, would you be willing to, or if you have a link to that or something, that's a cool idea. The infographic approach to the syllabus is useful. If you have links, it's really tricky with links. I try not to hyperlink too much in my syllabus because then I'd have to update that. I just direct them back to the Moodle page. And really because I was teaching undergraduates, my syllabus was a hard paper that I gave them. And then they had a version of it in the Moodle course. But really, I get them to Moodle because that's where the interactive content is. Okay, we're almost done, folks. So the last article that was really useful, this is getting at the question that people have been asking, like, what kinds of discussions, types of forums? And this researcher, she was teaching graduate students who are going to be teachers. So this might be helpful for those of you teaching graduate students. In her course, she includes 5 kinds of forums. This was a recurring forum that's really about substantive content in the course. So this is where students practice engaging with content. They build their understanding of content and integrate ideas in the content forums. That's what they were for, is to help further content understanding. She also had a virtual coffee shop, which from what I could understand, essentially takes place of the announcement tool. She doesn't really use a tool for announcements. Everything happens in the coffee shop forum, which is a communication channel. So she uses some examples that she pulls from those forums in her article. And some of it was like a student who had a problem, was confused and was upset. And that happened publicly in this communication channel, which I don't think I would have been comfortable with, but she's talking about how it was really transparent, how this conversation was happening. And her response was also visible to everyone and transparent. So that's how she did it. But you might use it for less hot button issues than just letting people have a place to talk to each other. But it's teachers and students, or students, everybody can participate in that one. She has this what she calls a voluntary product sharing. Really, it's a peer review. It's a draft forum. Like, if you want feedback on your draft, post it here. And all students can see her comments on that draft. So it's kind of like a public feedback forum, draft forum. So she makes specific forums for teams who are trying to collaborate, really to facilitate their discussion and a place for them to share out at different times. So I think it seemed like each team had a forum where they had a reporting space there. And it was tied to each team and not to the whole class, from what I could tell. And then the last thing she does is a kind of forums where students can practice specific skills. And she doesn't really go into super detail about the difference between her content forum and her skills forum, except that it almost seems sort of like a draft. Like they could do a draft of a thing and get some feedback before they submitted it to her for a grade. So similar to the product sharing format. But I include this simply because in this article, she gives lots and lots of examples, even like samples from those forums. And just to underscore this idea that you can use this tool for lots of different purposes in your course. So I think it's helpful to sort of pull back these like key strategies now. After all of this I've shown you about discussion forums, let's pull to the top some things that I think are high yield. In terms of student engagement, so this is like 3 different parts. So the student part, getting students engaged, make it matter. It has to matter or they won't do it. And why should they, if we're being really fair? It needs to be graded in some way. It needs to contribute to their score. And it's better if it can be building toward a larger project. So all the work they do is meaningful because it's building, it's helping them prepare content or in some way process toward a larger end goal. Make it interesting if you can, with variety. Make it authentic, an authentic conversation, having them grapple with actual questions from the field. It needs to be applicable to them, but also to the work they're doing in your course, to their program, to their eventual field of study. Make it meaningful, and to get at that, this is pulling down some of that writing, meaningful writing research, is make it really rigorous to the end that they have to grapple with ideas. Not so hard that they're like, this is impossible, I'm not going to do this. But if they aren't struggling to understand a thing, then they're really just saying what they think and moving on. And we know that you have to struggle with concepts to really make them stay with you. Try to make it meaningful by connecting it to other things that they're doing, particularly extracurricular contexts or post-curricular once they're done. If you can make it theirs, then they will like it. We know this. So give them ownership in any way that you can and some autonomy. So having them come up with the questions, giving them a choice of questions, trying to amplify their voices when you interact instead of overshadowing their voices when you interact. Having them feel like they can grapple with the thing and come to some better understanding, and to see that is really powerful for them. So key strategies for our engagement: know what our roles are in that, which is different than the roles the students will have in that discussion. Some of us feel like, well, we're all having a conversation together, but even when you're doing a face-to-face conversation, your role is very different from the role of students in those conversations, even if we don't fully analyze it because we just sort of do it intuitively. Our job is to manage that momentum, and we want to be sure that our intercession into that section or into that discussion is doing that. Moderating. I mean, there are times maybe when students are grappling or maybe, arguing over something that needs to be sorted to keep them productively discussing the topic. Spotlighting people who are either doing a thing in a way that you want or having a good idea, right? You might just spotlight something that is a particularly thoughtful response to someone else, or that it's closer to your target behavior, so you want to spotlight that. Because if you spotlight anything, other students will try to do the same thing as the thing that got the attention, whether they know that they're doing that or not. Summarizing and also keeping students accountable to do that. That's our job in all of teaching, sadly. You want to participate, but moderately. We talked about that a little bit. Try to focus comments and questions that enlarge and perpetuate the conversation. Something I hadn't thought about, but that some of the research pointed out, is that when teachers say, "Good point, I agree," then students stop talking about that topic. That thread is done because you have spoken. You have said this person is right, and there's no point in discussing this anymore because you have come down with your judgment and it's good and it's right. Conversation just stops there. I hadn't thought about that, so I'm going to be careful next time even in face-to-face conversation, to agree or disagree sort of ends a conversation. you want to design these things with the learning goals in mind. I'm sorry, I know Setsi tells this to you all the time, but it's so really critical. Learning first, tool second, that's basic ed technology rule, and it's really, really pertinent here. Just saying you have to reply to 2 people is thinking about the tool and how you're going to sort of make points out of it, rather than what do they need to do in terms of their thinking. What kind of thinking do I want them to do? How can I see that they've done that thinking? The last point, like scoring and feedback, try to make your scores and your feedback communicate clear expectations and shape their future performance. A rubric can be really, really helpful for that. Make it worth a moderate percentage of their grade. The research recommends 10 to 20%. That's 1 to 2 letter grades of their final grade comes from how well they perform. So you really have to be clear about what good performance looks like to you and where on the spectrum of percentage points or letter points you would put specific kinds of behaviors. You want to consider the purpose and the nature of the student activity when you're deciding whether or not to grade it with feedback or just assign points for completion. I'm going to pause on this point because this is a question I get all the time. I don't want to read the forums. I don't need to read the forums. I don't care what they write in the forums. I just need to give them points for doing it. I understand. I sometimes feel that way too. But if you don't ever look at it, they probably will not do their best work there if they know that you're never going to know if they did or didn't. So if you want them to do it and you want them to do it with care, you probably have to in some way let them know that you're seeing that they've done it. Or telling them, look, asking them to reflect on how much they're getting out of it, so it still feels like it's useful. If you just need them to do it and you really honestly don't care, then you can just set an activity completion, and Moodle will give you a log that tells you if they make 1 post and 2 replies, Moodle will tell you who has done that, and then you can just give them a score. But as we sort of talked about in Don Schweitzer's presentation on Tuesday, for pretty much the same amount of effort, you can attach a rubric that actually has a little bit of feedback and guidance. For the exact same amount of effort you would put in, you can actually give them a score with guidance, which I would recommend. A compromise, you might be interested in this, is something that I call a collect and reflect assignment, where you do have them weekly doing this forum and you're kind of just making sure they do it. And periodically you ask them to look back through their own posts and select 1 or 2 and reflect on that as a particularly good example of whatever, right? And then you attach some sort of thinking, critical thinking expectation to that. And then that's the thing that you grade against like academic criteria. How well did you reflect? How well are you thinking? How well do you understand the concepts or the performance that's being asked? So a collect and reflect can be a good compromise. Maybe you only have to do that twice in the semester. So the rest of it, you're just like scoring by completion. And this part you look at more closely and give them feedback. And you can even stagger those so you don't get everybody's collect reflect in the same week. So that's a way to sort of compromise between, I just want them to do it and I don't care how well they do it and I'm not going to read it, to I really want to shape behavior. Jennifer, Antic, do you have a hand up now, or is that a hand up from before? I guess that's from before. Okay, Jennifer, if you have a question, feel free to come on in. Look, questions and comments. And we made it to the end. And I am early. I'm very happy. So what do you guys think? I see that Teresa put in a couple of links to playlists and student choice. And so those are all in the chat. I will translate the chat into a readable document and put it also in the Moodle course you can come back to later. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Actually, I might keep the share up in case you guys want me to go back to a previous slide. But what comments or questions do you have at this point? We've covered a ton of content. And yes, lunch comes right after this, but I want to give us a chance to pause and talk about it if we need to or want to.
Robbie, I have a question.
Sure.
Shouldn't we be reading the discussion posts in case students have inappropriate behavior like bullying or disclosing personal information. I mean, I had a student talk about sexual assault and whatever that I had to disclose, right? So I can't let things like that just kind of sit there and then I don't see them. That would be bad, and maybe even I'd be legally liable, right?
I think best practice is if you ask them to do it, if you're asking them to spend their time and effort to do a thing, we should give it the attention and some measure of feedback in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, why are we asking them to do it? There are some things we just want them to do because it's good for them, right? But if it's a public space, we do have a responsibility for monitoring that in some way. And I think it's really helpful if it's really truly their thinking
Right.
made visible. You kind of want to know what they think. But there's sort of a difference between skimming it just sort of monitor, and then when you're going to deal with the scoring / grading, you're going to do that by completion later. You're not going to count discussion forum posts or count words or something like that. That might be a case where you're still accountable for monitoring as it goes along, but when you're trying to account for it into the grades, you might do that without feedback. Note that their performance probably won't change if you don't give them any feedback. And if it's just a number of feedback, we're back in hot or colder, and that's very ineffective for changing behavior or performance. So a rubric can be really easy to use, and it can give them some guidance and a talking point if the student comes to you and says, I don't get why you're not giving me full credit in the forums. So yes, that's a very good point, Ramona. So students do tend to speak more freely in discussion forums once they get comfortable than they would in an assignment to you, because it does sort of, I think it triggers for them that the kinds of communication patterns that they are in when they're communicating with others, in text or chat or, I don't know, Snapchat or whatever those other things are that they do. Jennifer Hardiker has a question. Did that answer everything for you, Ramona? Cool. Okay, Jennifer Hardiker in the chat asks, do I have thoughts about using discussion forums versus breakout rooms as a way to engage in this way? Yes, I would say the key difference is discussion forums are not ever going to be instantaneous or synchronous, really. They're still always going to be asynchronous, especially in our discussion forums in Moodle, because there's a 30-minute lag. Students have a 30-minute window of regret after they post their first question. That's only funny if you've only heard me say it once or twice. Those of you who've heard me say that a lot, you're like, oh my gosh, Robbie, that's such a tired old joke. But I really love it, so I'm going to keep saying it. The 30-minute window of regret. So their post will not be visible in the discussion forum for 30 minutes after they make it. So they have 30 minutes to change it, which means that it's not instantaneous, the discussion. Whereas if they're in a breakout room, I say something and you hear me and you say something. So back to Phil's point in the beginning, sometimes you want that spontaneous sort of discussion, in which case I would use a breakout room. The tricky thing is you won't have a written record of what happened of those exchanges. You can ask them to record it down to their computer and send you the thing. Some profs are doing that. Send you the recording later. I think that they had actually surprisingly high compliance with that request, but it's not the same. And it's not something you can come back to and say, hey, let's look at your thinking here in this forum. Let's use this as a stepping stool or a stepping stone or the seed of a future academic product in the same way. Does that answer your question, Jen?
Yeah. I think I was struggling with, I had taught an online summer class, and I was struggling with that idea of seeing evidence of everyone's thinking in the breakout rooms, unless I had them do the recording. And then, I didn't have great success with folks doing the recording, like, oh, it failed, or oh, I forgot, or whatever the case was.
It's easy to forget. Let me just say, in their defense, it is harder to remember to do that once you're just going. So yeah, if you really, and part of the thing to think about is, would it be useful for them to have this text, this writing going forward for some reason? Like they're going to work up a reflection paper now, or they're going to apply this to something forward, then that's really useful to have that record. And if it's really just so that you can monitor what they were saying, it might be better to visit breakout rooms and ask them to report out periodically, maybe have them do a write-up that other people don't see to talk about how did it go and were there problems. That might be a better way to monitor sort of behavior there versus trying to capture that conversation as a thinking, as a component in a future academic application, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm throwing around a lot of words. Let's see, so Chris Marcus has a comment. Thoughts and experience with getting more engagement, volunteering their questions about content on discussion boards since it's not anonymous. Like they might feel foolish asking a question. Assuming that if the discussion board isn't tied to completion, right. So I have heard this question often. I had this issue in the beginning, and I can tell you how I solved it when I was teaching fully online courses with developmental students through PCC, developmental education. So they were none of them were confident in their ability to express themselves in language, even orally versus written. So they just wanted to just email me. And what I would do, if it was a question about operations or about an assignment, not a content question necessarily, if it's about operations, maybe I would even do this for content. I would just take the email and I would reply in the forum. I would say, thanks for your email. I put the reply in the forum. So I just keep redirecting them back to that thing. And I would encourage them. I would say, hey, look, if you ask this question in the forum, somebody else might be online when I'm not, and you can get an answer fast. This is especially useful for higher level students, like graduate students or seniors or something. They're like, I need to know right now, is it this or this? Or where is this template that you want me to use? I can't find it. If students start to answer each other in there, and then you can be like, go in and answer that thread and be like, hey, great job, Dom. I'm so glad that you came in. Thanks for helping me out. See, this is why you should post in the forum. So you have to train them to use that tool. And the more activity they see in it, the more normalized it will feel for them. Now, questions about the content, like what we tend, this is sort of basic active learning sort of questioning strategy. You could be like, okay, what are your questions? People will just look at you with dead fish face, right? At least with undergraduates, they're like, nobody say anything because we might get out of class 10 minutes early if you all just sit quiet. And then they like give bad looks to whoever actually says something. What you can say is something like, okay, you all have to do a yes, yes, no. You all have to, in the forum, say 2 things that you understood or you agreed with or that you thought were interesting, and at least 1 thing that is unclear or that you didn't understand or that you just can't get behind, whatever. Like yes, yes, no is just a shorthand tactic I use sometimes. And you can either have them, I often have them write it in their notebook, but if you're doing an online class or a synchronous hybrid course, you can say, all right, in the forum, put your questions, even if that forum isn't for points, right? And then you answer out of that forum. Like if you use the forum itself and you refer people back to it and you open it, they start to understand that that's how you want them to communicate. You will have to remind them though, because their default is just to email you a question, especially if they're a little bit shy about asking that question. So Sarah White asked, do I put the whole email in the discussion forum with the student name? It depends on the question. If it's a personal question, right? If it's like a question about why did you give me an F? I think you hate me. You certainly don't want to put that in the forum. But if it's a question about content or about operations, I would definitely put that there. You can either say, hey, you know, Charlotte had a really good question and I'm just going to put it here so we can all see the question. I can answer you all at once because some of you probably have this really good question too. Then Charlotte doesn't care that I used her voice because her name, because I like held her up as having a really good question. Look how smart she is. But if it was anything else that we thought they might be unsure about, and I think Sarah, if I'm not mistaken, you teach like enormous classes. Is this right? You like 100 people or something like this? Yeah. Like I got a really great question in my email. You don't want 100 students emailing you. No, you really want to train them to put the things in this forum. So you can answer the question once and they can all just see that question. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Sarah? Yes, excellent. All right. Other comments? Do you have any yes, no's? Anybody want to play with that idea? I don't want to keep you super long, but I want to make sure we have a chance to sort of debrief together from all of this research and best practice I've given you before I send you off with your challenge, should you choose to accept it. You feel free to come on with the mic if you want.
Say, Robbie, this is Phil. Do you have the challenge written up in the Moodle course? Is that it? Because I'm hungry. I'm going to go eat lunch. But, but
Okay.
after that, I'm not.
All right,
I'm
all
not
right. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's the challenge. By popular request, in your independent work time, I made a little worksheet. Should it be useful for you? You totally do not have to do it. Robbie is not going to give you homework in summer class, but it might be helpful to just guide your thinking. So I included it. So it really basically asks these questions for each different section. It asks these same 3 sort of prompts for writing in your course and for online forums in your course. So what best practice strategies do you want to incorporate, or maybe reincorporate, or adjust, or maybe refine? So if you can sort of, the goal of this question is to get you to sort of call out by name or to attach back to specific strategies. Identify key actual strategies, maybe tease them out of a practice you already have in your class, but to recognize those strategies you do or want to start doing. And how might those strategies actually help your learning outcomes or solve problems for you? So giving you a chance to sort of try to, why would I use this strategy? How is it going to help me or help my students? And then are there challenges or impediments that you might encounter in starting to implement these in your courses? Might be that you don't completely understand it, or you like, how am I ever going to have the time to do it? Something like that. And then the last question is like, what questions do you still have about any of these things for online breaks? So you'll see on the worksheet that's posted in the Moodle course, you'll see these 3 clusters of questions happen twice, once for online learning, once for online writing, and once for discussion forums. Okay, so Ramona says, yes, yes, no will work well with ethics classes. Yes, I think so. I have found it works very well with undergraduates. If they're just like, I don't know, I'm like, well, okay, pick 2 things that you can say yes to and 1 thing that you can say no to, and you can interpret that as broadly as you like. It always gets them to put something down. I think that's helpful. Okay, so do you have any other questions? Any last comments? Besides that you're hungry and I've kept you a long time and it's hot, so I need to turn the air conditioner on. You guys won't be able to hear me if I do, because it's a funny little portable one. All right, let's call it then. I'm going to give you more time for individual work time or just downtime, whatever you need to do for you should do. Jennifer asks, what are we working on? So there's a handout, a Word document that I have posted in Moodle right near the top. It's a little worksheet if it's helpful to guide your independent working time, to just start to think about what strategies for each of the different kinds of topics we've talked about. One of them is online writing or discussion forums. So you'll find that file in Moodle if you want to take a look at it. When we come back, we're just going to really debrief from, okay, what do you think now after you've thought about how you might incorporate any of these best practices or strategies into your own classes in an online or hybrid synchronous kind of course. Thanks, Chris just posted it in the link. It's a direct link to it.
I saw it. I just, sometimes you give us specifically like, go do this.
Right.
And I wasn't sure. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. So I just tried to not homework you guys, but I think it can be helpful to have a guiding document. So like after your lunch, you can be like, hey, what am I supposed to be, why would I be thinking about this? What do I want to do? If you are interested, that might be something that can help guide your thinking and your work. When you come back, we'll say, what are your questions now? What do you think? What are your comments? If it's something I need to demo when we come back, I'm happy to do that, to sort of look more in depth at any specific kinds of tools and things when we come back. If you can't come back, that's okay. I'll just miss you. But you're welcome to come back at 3. And we're going to come back at 3, from 3 to 4, not 2:30 this time. So we'll come back at 3, take a nice long break, enjoy your lunch, and hopefully I will see you. Brandon may not be able to come back, and that's okay. We've been seeing a very similar pattern of folks who are like, okay, that was enough. I don't need to come back afterward. Oh, Jennifer, I will make sure anybody who is not, if you're not be able to access the Moodle course, please shoot me an email and I'll make sure that you have access to that. Okay, guys, have a good lunch. We'll talk to you later. Bye, guys. See you this afternoon at 3.